I remember the shock hitting me like a wave of disbelief. My mind refused to accept it. She couldn't just be gone. Kate's voice pierced the night, frantic and hysterical, insisting she had checked everywhere. But the child wasn't there. Someone had taken her. What followed was the kind of nightmare every parent prays they'll never face. Yet beneath the chaos, the evidence began to tell a different story. There were no broken locks, no shattered glass, no sign of a struggle. Instead, there were stains beneath the tiles, the scent of death detected by trained dogs, a missing tennis bag, and a silent hour that no one could fully explain. These details didn't point to an abduction. They hinted at something darker, a cover-up. The world watched as police cordoned off the vacation apartment in Praia da Luz, Portugal. But what many don't know is that investigators would eventually return to that same property with shovels, ground-penetrating radar, and cadaver dogs to dig up the garden behind the apartment. What were they looking for? And why did it take so long to search there?
I just had this utter sensation of disbelief, and I was saying, they can't be gone, she can't be gone, she must be there. Kate was screaming hysterically that she'd checked and she was gone and someone had taken her. You're just thrown into this absolute nightmare. Terrifying.
The case of Madeleine McCann represents one of the most perplexing disappearances in modern history. A perfect storm of investigative missteps, media frenzy, and contradictory evidence. In the years since she vanished, theories have multiplied, suspects have emerged and faded away, and millions of dollars have been spent searching for answers. Yet the garden behind apartment 5A, a space measuring just a few hundred square feet, wasn't thoroughly examined until years after she disappeared. This oversight, if that's what it was, may have altered the entire trajectory of the investigation. Before we dive deeper into this haunting case, hit that subscribe button if you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries. This is Criminal Instinct, where we examine the darkest corners of true crime with the respect and attention they deserve. Where were you when you first heard about the Madeleine McCann case? Let me know in the comments below. On May 3, 2007, 3-year-old Madeleine McCann vanished from her family's vacation apartment in the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, a picturesque coastal town in Portugal's Algarve region. With her distinctive right eye, where her pupil bled into the iris, creating a unique marking called a coloboma, Madeleine became the face of missing children worldwide. Her image would soon appear on posters, billboards, and television screens across the globe, her wide-eyed smile haunting a generation. The McCann family, Kate and Jerry, both physicians from Leicestershire, England, and their 3 children, Madeleine and 2-year-old twins Sean and Amelie, had arrived just days earlier for a week-long spring vacation with 7 friends and their children. The adults, who would later be dubbed the Tapas 7, had made a habit of dining together at the resort's tapas restaurant, roughly 180 feet from the apartments where their children slept. This arrangement, which the group likened to dining in their backyard while children slept upstairs, would later be scrutinized by investigators and the public alike. The layout of apartment 5A would later become crucial to understanding what happened that night. Located on the ground floor at the corner of the resort complex, it had multiple points of access, a front door that opened to the street, and sliding glass patio doors that led to a garden area in the back. These patio doors, the McCanns would later explain, were left unlocked to allow easier access for their regular checks on the children. The apartment itself was modest. 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a living area. Madeleine slept in a bed near the window in the front bedroom, with the twins in cribs nearby. The Ocean Club Resort itself was not particularly secure. Like many vacation properties in the area, it lacked security cameras, keycard access, or regular security patrols. The complex was open, with multiple entry points and public roads running alongside it. During the tourist season, the area bustled with visitors, seasonal workers, and locals, creating an environment where strangers wouldn't necessarily stand out. According to Jerry McCann, he went into apartment 5A around 9:05 p.m. to check on his daughter, Madeleine. He said everything looked normal. She was asleep, nothing seemed disturbed. But this routine check would later become one of the most scrutinized moments in true crime history. Did he actually see Madeleine, or merely a shape in the darkened room? Did he enter the bedroom or simply glance in from the doorway? These questions would later take on immense significance. Just minutes earlier, around 9 p.m., their friend Matt Oldfield had offered to look in on the children while the adults dined together at a nearby restaurant. He later admitted that when he stepped inside, he didn't actually see Madeleine in her bed. He only glanced quickly and then left, assuming all was fine. That choice, to walk away without raising an alarm, would become one of the most hotly debated gaps in the timeline. If Madeleine was already gone by 9 p.m., why didn't Oldfield notice? And if she was still there, who took her in the brief window between his check and Jerry's? From 9:05 to 10 p.m., an entire hour slipped by unaccounted for. When Kate finally returned and discovered Madeleine was gone, the alarm was raised, tourists were called into the streets, and authorities were alerted. But by then, nearly 60 minutes had already passed, an eternity in a case like this, and in that void, silence hung heavy. Kate's discovery of the empty bed triggered a sequence of events that would quickly spiral beyond anyone's control. According to her account, she entered the apartment through the unlocked patio doors, noticed a draft, and found the bedroom door open wider than she had left it. When she looked into the room, Madeleine's bed was empty. After searching the apartment, she ran back to the restaurant, famously crying out, "They've taken her!" This immediate conclusion, that Madeleine had been abducted rather than wandered off, would later be questioned by investigators. The initial response was chaotic. The case would become one of the most heavily reported missing person investigations in history, with media outlets from around the world descending on the small Portuguese town. This intense scrutiny would both help and hinder the search for Madeleine, creating pressure for quick answers in a case that defied simple explanations. The Portuguese Polícia Judiciária took lead on the investigation, but from the beginning there were complications. Cultural differences, language barriers, and differing police protocols created friction. While British authorities typically treat child disappearances as potential abductions immediately, Portuguese investigators initially approached it as a missing person case, considering multiple scenarios, including the possibility that Madeleine would shape the early days of the investigation and potentially cost valuable time. Inspector Gonçalo Amaral, who initially led the Portuguese investigation, later became a controversial figure in the case. His eventual theory, that Madeleine died accidentally in the apartment and her parents concealed her death, would lead to his removal from the case and subsequent legal battles with the McCanns. But in those first crucial hours, his team faced an unprecedented situation, an international missing child case under intense media scrutiny in a small tourist town with limited resources. The apartment wasn't treacly destroying evidence. This fundamental error in crime scene management would haunt the investigation for years to come. Fingerprints found in the apartment couldn't be definitively linked to an intruder because so many people had legitimate reasons to be there after the alarm was raised. DNA evidence was similarly compromised by the parade of visitors through the small apartment. The first formal searches of the apartment and surrounding areas began on May 4th. Police dogs were brought in, but not specialized cadaver dogs or blood detection dogs. Those wouldn't arrive until months later. Officers conducted door-to-door inquiries throughout the resort and surrounding neighborhoods. Volunteers continued searching the beaches and nearby terrain. Apartment 5A was dusted for fingerprints, and forensic teams collected potential evidence, including a sample from a spot of blood found on a wall. But something was missing from these early efforts: a thorough examination of the ground beneath and around Apartment 5A itself. The garden area, accessible through those unlocked patio doors, wasn't subjected to the kind of intensive forensic examination that might have revealed disturbed soil, buried evidence, or traces of DNA. This oversight seems particularly striking given that the garden offered both privacy and convenience for someone looking to temporarily conceal evidence. Was this simply an investigative blind spot, or did the focus on an abduction theory direct attention away from the immediate surroundings of the apartment? Jane Tanner, one of the Tapas 7, reported seeing a man carrying a child near the apartment around 9:15 p.m. on the night of the disappearance. She described a man walking hurriedly away from the resort, carrying what appeared to be a sleeping child in pajamas. This sighting became a central focus of the early investigation, with police releasing a sketch based on her description. Years later, British investigators would identify this figure as an innocent tourist carrying his own child back from the resort's evening childcare, a revelation that would eliminate one of the key sightings supporting the abduction theory. Another witness, Martin Smith, reported seeing a similar figure carrying a child toward the beach around 10:00 p.m. The Smith sighting gained significance later in the investigation when Martin Smith claimed the man's gait and bearing reminded him of Jerry McCann himself, a controversial identification that added fuel to theories implicating the parents. These conflicting sightings fueled speculation and directed investigative resources toward searching the surrounding area rather than focusing on the apartment and its immediate vicinity. Meanwhile, the media circus grew. Journalists from around the world descended on the small Portuguese town, transforming it from a quiet tourist destination to the center of a global news story. Camera crews set up outside the Ocean Club Resort. Reporters ambushed anyone connected to the case, and satellite trucks lined the narrow streets. This intense scrutiny created immense pressure on investigators to produce results quickly, potentially at the expense of methodical, thorough police work. The McCanns became both the subjects of immense sympathy and eventually intense scrutiny. They hired a PR specialist and established a fund to finance the search for their daughter. They met with the Pope and traveled across Europe raising awareness about Madeleine's case. Their composed public appearances, while effective at keeping Madeleine in the news, eventually led some to question their emotional responses. Were they remarkably resilient parents fighting for their child, or were they performing grief for the cameras while hiding a darker truth? This question would divide public opinion and influence the direction of the investigation. As days turned to weeks without a breakthrough, Portuguese authorities began to explore other possibilities beyond abduction. They interviewed the McCanns and their friends repeatedly, looking for inconsistencies in their accounts. They examined phone records, credit card transactions, and internet search histories. They questioned resort staff and local residents with criminal histories. But the investigation seemed to stall, caught between competing theories and hampered by the contaminated crime scene. If you're finding this story as compelling as I did, hit the like button so more people can learn about this case. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. It wasn't until July, more than 2 months after Madeleine's disappearance, that investigators brought in British cadaver dogs and blood detection dogs. This decision would prove pivotal, introducing new evidence that would dramatically shift the direction of the investigation and eventually lead authorities back to the garden behind apartment 5A. The dogs' alerts would raise disturbing questions about what really happened on the night of May 3, 2007, questions that remain unanswered to this day. The cadaver dogs' alerts inside apartment 5A sent shockwaves through the investigation. Eddie, a dog trained to detect the scent of human remains, alerted in the McCann's bedroom, in a corner near the wardrobe and behind the sofa in the living room. Keela, a blood detection dog, signaled in some of the same locations. The dogs also alerted on items belonging to the McCanns, including Kate's clothes and a stuffed animal belonging to Madeleine. The handler, Martin Grime, had worked with these dogs on numerous cases and vouched for their reliability. Eddie had never given a false positive in more than 200 previous deployments. Most significantly, both dogs alerted on the McCann's rental car, a vehicle they hadn't rented until 24 days after Madeleine's disappearance. This detail would become one of the most controversial elements of the case. How could the scent of death be present in a car that wasn't in the McCann's possession until more than 3 weeks after Madeleine disappeared? This anomaly fueled speculation that Madeleine's body had been moved and concealed after the initial police response, possibly multiple times. The dog alerts in the apartment could potentially be explained. If Madeleine had died there, accidentally or otherwise, her body might have remained long enough to leave the scent of decomposition. But the alerts in the rental car created a timeline problem that has never been satisfactorily resolved. If Madeleine died on May 3rd or 4th, what happened to her body in the intervening weeks before the McCanns rented the car? Was it temporarily concealed somewhere near the apartment, perhaps in that unexamined garden, before being moved to a more permanent location? Forensic teams collected samples from the locations where the dogs alerted. Initial reports from the Portuguese lab suggested a match to Madeleine's DNA, but later, more comprehensive testing by British forensic experts determined the samples were inconclusive. The DNA was degraded and could have belonged to any member of the McCann family. This forensic ambiguity has allowed competing narratives to persist. Those who believe the McCanns were involved point to the dog alerts as compelling evidence, while those who believe in their innocence emphasize the inconclusive DNA results. But here's where things get strange. Despite these alerts and the inconclusive forensic results, investigators didn't immediately conduct a thorough search of the ground beneath and around the apartment. The garden area behind the patio doors, an area with direct access to the apartment and a potential burial site, wasn't excavated until years later. This delay in searching such an obvious location has never been adequately explained and represents one of the most puzzling aspects of the investigation. Why the delay? Some point to jurisdictional issues and the complex international nature of the case. The Portuguese authorities led the investigation, but British police were increasingly involved, creating potential conflicts over investigative priorities. Others suggest that the focus on the McCanns themselves as potential suspects diverted resources from certain search efforts, and still others believe that the garden was initially dismissed because the abduction theory dominated the early investigation, directing attention away from the immediate vicinity of the apartment. The timeline itself contained troubling inconsistencies. Gerry McCann said he checked on the children at 9:05 p.m. and saw Madeleine sleeping. Yet Matthew Oldfield, who checked at 9:30 p.m., admitted he didn't actually see Madeleine, only the twins. Kate McCann discovered Madeleine missing at 10:10 p.m. This created a potential window of nearly an hour during which Madeleine could have disappeared, with no confirmed sighting of her after 9:05 p.m. This timeline becomes even more problematic when considering the statements of independent witnesses. An Irish family, the Smiths, reported seeing a man carrying a child matching Madeleine's description at around 10:00 p.m., the same time Kate was discovering her daughter missing. If this sighting was indeed of Madeleine, it creates a tight timeline for an abductor to have taken her and transported her across town. Some have suggested this timing aligns more closely with a scenario involving the parents than with an unknown abductor. Restaurant staff at the tapas bar provided statements that contradicted the McCann's account of regular checks on the children. Some witnesses reported that the table wasn't visible from all the apartments, making visual checks impossible. Others noted that the dinner reservation book showed no record of the group requesting a table with a view of the apartments, as they had claimed. The restaurant manager stated that the group's dinner that night was relaxed and convivial, with no indication of the frequent absences that regular room checks would have necessitated. What's the weather like where you're watching from? Imagine searching for evidence in those conditions. In Portugal, the spring weather was mild but variable, with occasional rain that could have affected outdoor search efforts and potentially washed away crucial evidence. The night of May 3rd was unusually cold for the season, with temperatures dropping into the 50s Fahrenheit. This detail becomes relevant when considering that Madeleine was reportedly wearing light pajamas. If she had wandered off on her own, the cold might have quickly become dangerous for a lightly dressed child. The McCann's behavior also came under scrutiny. Some investigators found it unusual that the couple maintained such composed public appearances, continuing their media campaign while under intense suspicion. They jogged regularly, attended church services, and gave numerous interviews, activities that some found inconsistent with the behavior of parents of a missing child. However, behavioral experts pointed out that grief manifests differently in different people, and the McCann's medical training might have enabled them to compartmentalize their emotions. Their supporters argued that maintaining physical health and public awareness of Madeleine's case were rational responses to an unimaginable situation. Kate McCann's refusal to answer 48 questions during a formal police interview in September 2007 raised eyebrows. After being named official suspects, or arguidos under Portuguese law, both McCanns were questioned separately. While Jerry answered all questions, Kate declined to respond to 48 specific inquiries on the advice of her lawyer. These questions, later leaked to the media, focused on the events of May 3rd and the cadaver dog evidence. Her silence, while legally prudent, fueled speculation about what she might be hiding. Perhaps most puzzling was the reported scent of death detected by the cadaver dogs. These highly trained animals can detect the odor of human remains even after a body has been removed from a location. For the scent to be present in the apartment and later in a car rented weeks after the disappearance raised troubling questions that investigators couldn't easily dismiss. Martin Grime, the dog handler, testified that the scent of death can linger for years but doesn't transfer easily between locations, suggesting that if the dogs were correct, a deceased person had been physically present in both the apartment and the car. The forensic evidence collected from the apartment and car included 15 out of 19 markers, matching Madeleine's DNA profile from a sample taken from the trunk of the rental car. While not a definitive match, which would require all 19 markers, this finding was statistically significant. However, experts noted that the sample was small and degraded, potentially leading to false positives. The McCanns explained that the DNA could have come from Madeleine's clothing or belongings transported in the car, a plausible explanation that couldn't be definitively ruled out. As the investigation progressed, attention increasingly turned to what might lie beneath the surface, both figuratively in terms of the case's unanswered questions and literally in terms of the ground surrounding apartment 5A. The garden, with its easy access from the apartment and relative privacy, represented a logical place to search for evidence. Yet years would pass before this obvious step was taken, leaving a critical gap in the investigative record. The garden behind apartment 5A wasn't just any patch of ground. It represented one of the most accessible and private areas connected to the scene of Madeleine's disappearance. With direct access through the patio doors that the McCanns admitted were left unlocked, it offered a potential escape route for an abductor, or a convenient location to temporarily conceal evidence. The garden's proximity to the apartment made it an obvious place to search thoroughly, yet this didn't happen in the crucial early days of the investigation. The garden itself was modest, a small partially enclosed area with some shrubbery and a low wall separating it from neighboring properties. It wasn't particularly secluded, but at night, with most tourists dining or in their apartments, it would have offered enough privacy for someone to dig quickly without being observed. The soil was typical of the region, sandy and relatively easy to disturb. These conditions would have made it possible to bury a small body or evidence temporarily, with minimal tools and time required. The garden theory gained traction years after the initial disappearance, particularly following a review of the case by British authorities. In 2014, 7 years after Madeleine vanished, Scotland Yard officers and Portuguese police returned to Praia da Luz with ground-penetrating radar equipment, cadaver dogs, and forensic archaeologists. Their mission: to excavate specific areas around the Ocean Club resort, including the garden behind apartment 5A. This renewed interest in the garden raised questions about why such an obvious location hadn't been thoroughly examined years earlier. The science behind these renewed search efforts was sophisticated. Ground-penetrating radar uses radio waves to detect anomalies beneath the soil, disturbances that might indicate digging, buried objects, or changes in soil composition. The technology can identify areas where soil has been disturbed even years after the fact, as the natural layering of soil takes time to re-establish itself after being disrupted. These disturbances appear as anomalies in the radar data, flagging areas for closer examination. Forensic archaeologists can identify subtle differences in soil layers that might suggest the ground was disturbed and then replaced. They look for changes in soil color, texture, and compaction that indicate digging. Even years later, these experts can often determine if soil has been disturbed and approximately when the disturbance occurred. Their expertise allows them to distinguish between recent gardening activities, animal burrows, and the kind of digging associated with concealing evidence. And cadaver dogs, as we've discussed, can detect the scent of human remains even years after a body has been removed. The chemical compounds released during decomposition can bind to soil particles, leaving traces detectable by specially trained dogs long after the source has been removed. This capability makes cadaver dogs valuable even in cold cases, where physical evidence might have degraded beyond recognition. The excavation process was methodical and exhaustive. Teams divided the search areas into grids, carefully removing layers of soil and documenting everything they found. They searched not only the garden directly behind apartment 5A, but also nearby scrubland and other locations identified through intelligence gathering. The operation lasted for 8 days and involved dozens of specialists from multiple countries. It represented the most thorough physical search of the area since Madeleine's disappearance. What they found, or didn't find, remains controversial. Officially, authorities announced that these searches yielded no significant evidence related to Madeleine's disappearance. No human remains were discovered, no clothing or personal items belonging to Madeleine turned up in the soil. The garden, it seemed, held no obvious secrets. But absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence, particularly when so much time had passed. But some experts have questioned whether the searches came too late. After 7 years, evidence could have degraded beyond recognition. If a body had been temporarily buried and then moved, traces might have been washed away by years of rain or disturbed by gardening and maintenance. The scent detected by cadaver dogs years earlier suggested that something might have been there once, but was no longer present when the excavations finally took place. The delay in searching this critical area may have permanently compromised the investigation. This case has affected so many people worldwide. If you're finding value in this deep dive, consider sharing this video with someone who appreciates thoughtful, true crime analysis. Your shares help ensure these stories reach those who care about finding the truth. The garden theory connects to broader questions about the timeline of that night. If something happened to Madeleine before the alarm was raised at 10 p.m., the garden offered a temporary solution, a place to conceal evidence until a more permanent arrangement could be made. The missing tennis bag reported by some witnesses could have been used to transport a small body. The rental car obtained weeks later could have been used for a secondary relocation. This scenario would explain both the cadaver dog alerts and the lack of conclusive forensic evidence. The body was present long enough to leave the scent of decomposition, but was moved before investigators could find it. The theory also addresses one of the most perplexing aspects of the case. If Madeleine died in the apartment, how did her parents manage to conceal her body while under intense scrutiny? The garden provided a potential answer, a temporary hiding place accessible directly from the apartment, requiring minimal movement in public spaces. Later, when media attention had somewhat subsided and the McCanns had more freedom of movement with their rental car, a more permanent solution could have been arranged. Critics of the garden theory point to the practical difficulties involved. The McCanns were strangers in Praia da Luz, unfamiliar with the area, and under intense scrutiny almost immediately after reporting Madeleine missing. Would they have had the knowledge, opportunity, and composure to bury their daughter's body and then maintain a convincing public facade of grief and determination? Their supporters argue that this scenario stretches credulity beyond reasonable limits. Supporters of the theory counter that the McCanns' medical training might have enabled them to respond to a crisis with unusual composure. They point to the couple's physical fitness, both were joggers, and intelligence as factors that would have helped them execute a complex cover-up. They also note that the initial police response was chaotic, and that the McCanns had the assistance of friends who might have knowingly or unknowingly helped them. The garden excavations represented a turning point in the investigation, an acknowledgement that the ground itself might hold answers that witnesses and suspects couldn't or wouldn't provide. The fact that these searches came so late in the investigation represents one of its most significant failures. Whether the garden ever contained Madeleine's body or evidence related to her disappearance may never be known with certainty. But the delay in thoroughly examining this obvious location raises troubling questions about the investigation's priorities and thoroughness. What they found, or didn't find, remains controversial. Officially, authorities announced that these searches yielded no significant evidence related to Madeleine's disappearance. No human remains were discovered. No clothing or personal items belonging to Madeleine turned up in the soil. The garden, it seemed, held no obvious secrets. But absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence, particularly when so much time had passed. But some experts have questioned whether the searches came too late. After 7 years, evidence could have degraded beyond recognition. If a body had been temporarily buried and then moved, traces might have been washed away by years of rain or disturbed by gardening and maintenance. The scent detected by cadaver dogs years earlier suggested that something might have been there once, but was no longer present when the excavations finally took place. The delay in searching this critical area may have permanently compromised the investigation. This case has affected so many people worldwide. If you're finding value in this deep dive, consider sharing this video with someone who appreciates thoughtful true crime analysis. Your shares help ensure these stories reach those who care about finding the truth. The garden theory connects to broader questions about the timeline of that night. If something happened to Madeleine before the alarm was raised at 10 p.m., the garden offered a temporary solution, a place to conceal evidence until a more permanent arrangement could be made. The missing tennis bag reported by some witnesses could have been used to transport a small body. The rental car obtained weeks later could have been used for a secondary relocation. This scenario would explain both the cadaver dog alerts and the lack of conclusive forensic evidence. The body was present long enough to leave the scent of decomposition, but was moved before investigators could find it. The theory also addresses one of the most perplexing aspects of the case. If Madeleine died in the apartment, how did her parents manage to conceal her body while under intense scrutiny? The garden provided a potential answer, a temporary hiding place accessible directly from the apartment, requiring minimal movement in public spaces. Later, when media attention had somewhat subsided and the McCanns had more freedom of movement with their rental car, a more permanent solution could have been arranged. Critics of the garden theory point to the practical difficulties involved. The McCanns were strangers in Parental, unfamiliar with the area, and under intense scrutiny almost immediately after reporting Madeleine missing. Would they have had the knowledge, opportunity, and composure to bury their daughter's body and then maintain a convincing public facade of grief and determination? Their supporters argue that this scenario stretches credulity beyond reasonable limits. Supporters of the theory counter that the McCanns' medical training might have enabled them to respond to a crisis with unusual composure. They point to the couple's physical fitness, both were joggers, and intelligence as factors that would have helped them execute a complex cover-up. They also note that the initial police response was chaotic and that the McCanns had the assistance of friends who might have knowingly or unknowingly helped them. The garden excavations represented a turning point in the investigation, an acknowledgement that the ground itself might hold answers that witnesses and suspects couldn't or wouldn't provide. The fact that these searches came so late in the investigation represents one of its most significant failures. Whether the garden ever contained Madeleine's body or evidence related to her disappearance may never be known with certainty. But the delay in thoroughly examining this obvious location raises troubling questions about the investigation's priorities and thoroughness. However, extensive searches of the surrounding area never located any trace of Madeleine, making a simple accident seem unlikely. Search teams with dogs covered the beaches, streets, and undeveloped areas around Parental. Divers examined the ocean and local wells. If Madeleine had wandered off and suffered an accident, it seems probable that some evidence would have been found during these searches. The complete absence of any trace suggests either an extraordinary coincidence or human intervention to remove evidence. The most controversial theory, and the one that Portuguese authorities initially pursued, is that Madeleine died accidentally in the apartment, possibly from a fall or medication overdose, and her parents concealed her death. This theory is supported by the cadaver dog alerts and certain behavioral analyses, but contradicted by the lack of conclusive forensic evidence and the practical difficulties of hiding a body in an unfamiliar location while under intense scrutiny. Proponents of this theory point to several pieces of circumstantial evidence: the cadaver dog alerts in the apartment and rental car, Kate's refusal to answer 48 questions during police questioning reported inconsistencies in the timeline provided by the McCanns and their friends, and the statistical rarity of stranger abductions compared to incidents involving family members. They suggest that Madeleine might have woken while her parents were at dinner, attempted to climb on furniture, and suffered a fatal fall. Critics of this theory emphasize the lack of motive for the McCanns to conceal an accidental death. As doctors, they would have known that an accidental fall or medication error, while tragic, would likely not result in criminal charges. They had no prior history of child abuse or neglect. Their decision to dine nearby while checking regularly on their children, while perhaps showing poor judgment, was not illegal and was practiced by many other parents at the resort. The enormous risk of attempting to conceal a death seems disproportionate to any potential consequence of reporting an accident.